on Quickly Quantum. This was the week quantum computing stopped being a research story and became a money story. A 5-year-old neutral atom startup just convinced investors it can skip the million qubit roadmap entirely, and the US government put $2 billion behind 9 companies to make sure America doesn't lose this race. Before that, in the headlines, IQM becomes Europe's first publicly traded pure-play quantum computing company. Google's Willow chip learns to correct its own errors while it's mid-calculation. And a fusion materials computation out of Oak Ridge somehow moved IBM's stock price. Welcome back to Quickly Quantum, your daily brief on the quantum frontier. It's Saturday, July 11th, 2026. And if you thought the news cycle in this sector was cooling off after a wild June, think again. Let's get into the week that was. Let's start where the week started. IQM, the Finnish-German quantum hardware maker, went public on Nasdaq, and that made it the first pure-play quantum computing company out of Europe to list on a major US exchange. We covered this Tuesday, so the short version, this wasn't just a nice milestone for Helsinki and Munich, it was the moment quantum stocks became a real, tradable basket that the broader market could actually punish or reward day to day. And it did both. IQM's debut rattled sector valuations almost immediately, and within days it was being directly blamed for pressure on IonQ's stock, which slid about 7% later in the week. Now, here's the skeptic note worth repeating, because it matters for the whole rest of this episode. Newly public quantum companies, IQM included, are still pre-revenue or barely revenue businesses. Going public doesn't create a customer base, it creates a stock ticker that can now swing on sentiment instead of substance. That's a new kind of risk for a sector that, until this year, mostly lived on grant money and VC term sheets insulated from daily market mood swings. Watch what happens the next time a rival lab publishes a bad benchmark, because now there's a public share price sitting there waiting to react to it. The IQM listing is the hinge this whole week turned on. It's the moment quantum's technical progress and quantum's stock market story became the same story, for better and for worse. And given how volatile this sector's headlines are, a breakthrough one day, a reality check piece the next, that's going to make for a bumpy ride for anyone actually holding these shares. We'll be watching whether more of the chips-backed firms follow IQM's lead toward public markets, because if they do, this sector's day-to-day news cycle just got a lot higher stakes. Now, the story that gave this whole week its shape. The White House convened a Quantum Innovation Summit, packing in close to 100 participants across industry, academia, and government to reinforce something the administration actually announced back in May: over $2 billion in CHIPS Act incentives flowing to 9 companies: IBM, Global Foundries, D-Wave, Rigetti, Atom Computing, Dirac, Inflection, PsiQuantum, and Quantinuum, in exchange for the government taking minority equity stakes in each of them. We covered the summit itself this week, so here's the short version of why it matters. This is the clearest signal yet that quantum computing has graduated from research grant territory into full-blown industrial policy, the same playbook Washington already ran with Intel and MP materials. As the official White House Office of Science and Technology Policy account at WHOSTP47 put it on X, the goal is delivering a scientifically relevant quantum computer and advancing quantum sensing and networking, starting now through these public-private partnerships. And Frontier Tech commentator at DesFrontierTech, quoting a first-hand account from the summit on X, described it this way. The announcements came one after another, and together they described a government that has decided to become a customer. That's the real headline underneath the headline. Washington isn't just funding quantum research anymore, it's positioning itself as a buyer. But hold on, because this isn't unanimous applause. House Democrats have formally objected that these awards exceed the CHIPS Act's statutory authority, arguing the money was appropriated for microelectronics, not equity stakes in quantum startups, and that Congress never authorized the government to take ownership positions in these companies in the first place. And DARPA's own benchmarking chief added a dose of cold water, cautioning that this industry is, in their words, full of big personalities and big claims, a warning DARPA presumably feels qualified to make, given it runs the government's own quantum benchmarking initiative. So you've got a summit full of good vibes, a genuine $2 billion commitment, and a live legal fight over whether any of it was done by the book. That tension isn't resolved. It's just getting started. Sticking with that same $2 billion package for a second, because here's a story that mostly slipped through the daily cracks this week, even though the headline version made it onto the show. Quantum Zeitgeist did the deeper reporting on where that chips money actually goes, company by company. Atom Computing is set to receive $100 million in planned funding to tackle manufacturing and technical challenges specific to neutral atom quantum computing. The same modality, worth noting, that Oratomic is betting its entire $300 million raise on, which we'll get to in a minute. Dirac is in line for up to $38 million to scale up its quantum logic units. And on the biggest end of the ledger, IBM is anchoring a brand new foundry subsidiary called Anduril with $1 billion of its own, while Global Foundries is getting $375 million. Now, why does this level of detail matter beyond the top line $2 billion number? Because it tells you where the government thinks the bottlenecks actually are: manufacturing and scaling, not raw physics breakthroughs. That's a meaningfully different bet than the venture capital story dominating headlines this week, which is chasing entirely new qubit architectures. And it reinforces the same skeptic note from the summit story. A formal congressional objection is already on record, arguing these equity stakes were never authorized by Congress in the first place. So even as checks go out the door, the legal foundation underneath this whole program is still being litigated in Washington, not just in the press. Now for the technical story of the week that actually deserves the word breakthrough, with some caveats. Google's quantum AI team demonstrated a version of its Willow chip that recalibrates itself in real time using reinforcement learning, a machine learning technique where the system improves its own behavior through trial and feedback, while a computation is actually running. And it set a new error record for logical qubits, which are the error-corrected qubits built by combining many noisy physical ones into one reliable unit. We covered this Thursday, so the short version: instead of calibrating a quantum chip once before a run and hoping the noise doesn't drift, Willow now adjusts its own error correction on the fly, mid-computation. Google's official research account posted about the broader push behind this on X, framing it as, quote, the first ever algorithm to achieve verifiable quantum advantage on hardware, calling it a significant step toward real-world applications. Here's my read, and it's a genuine caveat, not a dunk. Ars Technica's coverage of the underlying paper frames this more precisely as processor recalibration than as a machine truly learning in any human-like sense. It's real-time error mitigation dressed in learning system language, which is still useful, still novel, but worth separating from the marketing framing. The technique is legitimately clever engineering. The word learns is doing some of the lifting in the headline. Both things are true at once, and that's exactly the kind of story where a listener benefits from hearing both halves. Now, one more technical thread worth your attention, because it dominated the news cycle across 4 separate days this week and even moved IBM's stock price. Scientists from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Cleveland Clinic, and IBM used a quantum processor to calculate 9 molecular configurations of a material that could produce fuel for fusion energy, in what's being described as the first known instance of this kind of computation running on quantum hardware. On-chain analyst at Equinox_26 summarized it on X this way. The team modeled nuclear fusion plasma behavior, a problem classical computers handle poorly because of its combinatorial complexity, meaning the number of possible configurations explodes so fast that brute force classical computing chokes on it. That combinatorial complexity framing is exactly why quantum classical hybrid chemistry keeps showing up as a commercial story now, not just an academic one. It's the kind of narrow, well-defined molecular problem that plays to quantum's actual strengths today, rather than the sweeping, wait-till-we-break-encryption promises. But let's be precise about what actually happened. This is a proof-of-concept calculation on 9 configurations of one candidate material, not a fusion breakthrough, and that material itself is still years away from ever sitting inside a working reactor. The fact that this moved IBM's share price at all tells you something about how thin the line has gotten this week between genuine technical progress and market-moving hype. Now here's one that flew almost entirely under the radar this week and deserves more airtime than it got. Researchers demonstrated strong coupling between an electron trapped on superfluid helium and a single microwave photon, a milestone for a qubit modality that's been theorized on paper for decades but never pulled off at this level in a real lab. If you're not familiar with electron-on-helium qubits, think of them as a dark horse fifth option sitting alongside the more familiar approaches: superconducting circuits like Google's, trapped ions like quantinuums, neutral atoms like Oratomics and Q-eras, and photonics. What makes this genuinely novel is that strong coupling to a microwave photon is a prerequisite for building the kind of controllable, connected qubit system you'd need to scale this modality up at all. And until now, nobody had cleanly demonstrated it. The honest caveat is right there in the plan's own framing. This is still a fundamental physics demonstration involving essentially one qubit, nowhere close to a scalable multi-qubit system. And electron-on-helium remains one of the least mature modalities in the entire field. But in a week dominated by billion-dollar headlines, it's worth remembering that some of the most interesting quantum news is still happening in a single lab with a single trapped electron, far from any stock ticker. And a quick companion piece to that silicon storyline that ran hot all week. Dirac's foundry-fabricated qubits, high-fidelity results and all. Researchers from CIC Nanogoon and Quantum Motion, publishing in Nature Sensors, demonstrated an ultra-compact readout sensor for spin qubits precise enough to actually support quantum error correction protocols. In plain terms, before you can correct a qubit's errors, you first have to be able to read its state accurately and quickly, and this sensor does that in a package small enough to eventually sit alongside thousands of qubits on a single silicon chip. It's a component-level advance, not a finished processor. Folding it into a full multi-qubit error-corrected chip is still a future step, and the plan is honest that this is early. But silicon qubits keep making this quiet, unglamorous case that they could scale using semiconductor manufacturing techniques the chip industry already knows how to do at massive volume, which is exactly the kind of boring but important progress that gets drowned out by $300 million funding rounds. One more thread that deserves a moment before we get to our main story, because it's the real-world stakes underneath everything else this week. Reuters reports that crypto and financial infrastructure firms are accelerating their migration to post-quantum cryptography, encryption designed to resist a future quantum computer powerful enough to break today's standards, as that threat moves from theoretical to something firms are actively planning defenses against right now. This ties directly into a thread running through the whole week, from ISO adopting a post-quantum encryption standard called Classic McAleese to security firm Keyfactor's billion-dollar raise for quantum-safe infrastructure. And it connects uncomfortably well to Oratomic's own pitch, which we're about to dig into, that a fault-tolerant, code-breaking capable quantum machine might arrive sooner than the conventional timeline says. Now, the honest skeptic note here: the timeline for a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, one actually capable of breaking current encryption, remains deeply uncertain, and urgency framing in this space regularly outpaces the actual engineering reality. But institutions moving money and securing infrastructure don't get to wait for certainty. They have to plan for the tail risk now, which is exactly what this story shows happening in real time. Which brings us to the venture story of the week, and our main story for this recap. Oratomic's bet that fault-tolerant quantum computing doesn't need millions of qubits, just 10 to 20,000 of them. This Caltech-linked neutral atom startup, working with the kind of neutral atom qubits made from individually trapped atoms held in place by laser light, raised a $300 million Series A on the strength of a research claim that reads almost like a dare to the rest of the industry: that you need roughly 10,000 to 20,000 qubits to build a useful, fault-tolerant computer, not the millions that most roadmaps assume, and that the core components required to build that machine have already been experimentally demonstrated, just at a slightly smaller scale. Co-founder Manuel Endres has reportedly already trapped arrays of around 6,000 atoms, which the company is presenting as proof the path from here to 20,000 is more engineering than physics. Now, why does this number matter so much? Because the entire fault-tolerant quantum computing race has been implicitly organized around the assumption that you need a machine with 1 million or more physical qubits to get enough error-corrected logical qubits to do anything useful. That's the scale IBM, PsiQuantum, and most of the field have been planning factories, roadmaps, and funding rounds around. If Oratomic is right that the real number is closer to 20,000, that doesn't just change their own timeline, it potentially reshuffles who's actually closest to the finish line industry-wide. So who's buying this claim and who isn't? Vinod Khosla, founder of Khosla Ventures, is buying it in a big way. He posted on X that his firm made, quote, the largest initial investment yet, as we did in OpenAI, into Team Oratomic after we looked at a dozen quantum starts in a decade, framing the bet as Oratomic's path toward running Shor's algorithm, the factoring algorithm that would let a quantum computer break widely used encryption, calling that the true symbol of getting to quantum computing first. That's about as strong an endorsement as a VC voice gets, and Khosala's track record backing OpenAI early gives the quote some real weight. But here's my read, and it's where the healthy skepticism has to kick in. The 10 to 20,000 qubit figure is a theoretical projection from an archive paper, not a number pulled off a working device. Trapping 6,000 atoms in a lab array is a real, verified accomplishment. It is not the same thing as running a fault-tolerant algorithm on 20,000 logical qubits with all the error correction that requires. And Oratomic isn't racing in an empty lane. Q-Era is chasing neutral atom scaling with its own roadmap. Quantinuum's betting on trapped ions, and IBM has committed more than $10 billion toward its own fault-tolerant target by 2029, using an entirely different superconducting hardware path. 3 very different bets, 3 very different physics problems, all claiming they can get there first. And at most one of them gets to be right about the number that actually matters. So which one actually wins that argument? Nobody knows yet, and that's precisely why it's worth watching instead of just applauding. Time for the hype check. I'm putting this one at a 5 out of 10 on substance. The 6,000 atom trapping result is real, and it's genuinely impressive engineering. That part isn't hype. But the leap from that lab result to a 20,000 qubit fault-tolerant machine, and from there to breaking real-world encryption, is still almost entirely theoretical, riding on a paper's projection and a very confident round of VC money rather than a demonstrated device. $300 million buys you a lot of benefit of the doubt in this industry right now. It doesn't buy you a working computer yet. These are threads we'll keep pulling on through next week, especially as rival neutral atom and trapped ion teams respond to Oratomic's number with roadmaps of their own. If this recap helped you catch up on a busy week, follow Quickly Quantum wherever you're listening. New episodes drop every day, including the full daily versions of every story we just ran through. That's Quickly Quantum for today. New episodes every day. This is an AI voice podcast, created and built by a real person using today's cutting-edge technology. And remember, nothing on this show is financial advice. I'm Brian Lampert. See you tomorrow.